Hey guys, and welcome to my first ever game review on my new channel. I've been pretty excited for a while to put this up. Wanted to get right into it and start getting into the games that I've been playing. Some games that I played a while ago, some games I played really recently. The first one that I'm going to do is going to kind of lay out the format that I'm going to do the rest of mine on, more or less breaking games down into four categories that I'll talk about. Then assigning a score at the end that kind of gives an idea of my overall impression and overall rating of the game. The score is completely subjective. It's just my own opinion. So if I rate a game, pretty low that you really like, it doesn't mean that the game is objectively bad. It just means I didn't personally find it to be that great. But the first game that I'm going to do is a game that I have really thought about playing and probably should have played a long, long time ago. It's a game that a lot of people consider to be one of the best RPGs ever, if not the best game ever. And it's also a game in my favorite gaming series of all time. So, needless to say, the hype to play this game was pretty high, and that is Final Fantasy VI. I played it on Final Fantasy Anthology on the PS1. I bought Final Fantasy Anthology when it came out, but a decade and a half later, I finally played it and beat Final Fantasy VI at least. In large part because back in the day, my PS1, I started playing Final Fantasy V, which also comes on Anthology, and I thought at the time that the discs themselves there might be something weird with them because the games always ran super weird and were jumpy and crapped out a lot. But I think at this point, years later, it was probably just my PS1 being on its last legs. But tried to play five, play a little bit of six. Things happened. I never got around to finishing them, and then sort of they faded into the background. But getting back into playing stuff I'd always wanted to, Final Fantasy being my favorite series, it was just time to finally play the game that a lot of people consider to be the best Final Fantasy entry. So I sat down, I pushed everything else aside, and I beat Final Fantasy VI. And I'm here to give you an overview of what I thought of the game. The first aspect that I'm going to talk about in all of my reviews, but in this case, obviously for this game, is the story and the characters. Probably more so than anything else, when I'd heard or read people talking about this game, they talked mostly about how incredible and memorable the characters, story, and villain were. And I've got to say that I was a little bit let down in that regard. It's an old game. It's a game a lot of people have played, so there's really probably not a reason to sit here, for 10 minutes and explain the exact plot of the game. Most people that are interested probably already know. But I will break down the things that I thought stood out to me in either a positive or a negative way. The first thing is the fact that 14 playable characters in this game is a lot for a Final Fantasy. It's a lot for any game in my opinion, but being a big time Final Fantasy fan, at least the newer games, 14 characters. I was really intrigued when I read a while back that there was 14 characters because that seemed to me like a lot to really have to manage, and I really wondered if they do a good job, explaining a reason why there was 14 characters playable in the game. And I think in general it sort of hurt the character development angle for each. I didn't really feel like there was any characters that you really got to know extremely well. There was characters I liked more than others, characters that got more or less screen time, characters that had more or less backstory. I'm not saying that there was none of that, but having 14 characters, it felt cool in the sense that you could really vary up your four-person party at any given time because you had so many options, and the way that the different ways that people kind of came into the group were sort of interesting. But so many of the characters, I mean, without, I guess for future reference, there will be spoilers in these reviews because, or at least of the older games especially, because at this point, if almost, or I guess 20 years later, if you haven't already played Final Fantasy VI, you probably either don't care or, you know, anyone that is interested has probably already played the game, so I'm not too worried about spoiling things. But characters like Umaru and Mog, and even to a lesser extent, well, I mean Go-Go, to a lesser extent Strago and Realm. Yes, there was an actual legitimate reason that your party comes across them and they help you, but it's essentially, here's my reason for joining you. I join you. The rest of the game goes on. The game ends, and you get, a couple minutes maybe of explanation of their larger arc and why they're important, why you should care about them, and why they're interesting. And even the major characters of the game, I felt like weren't really that much more. You had clear reasons why they were in the story, but if you want to call Terra the major protagonist, the main character of the game. I know a lot of people say that this game doesn't have any main characters. It's more just an ensemble group, but I think Terra can be considered, if there's any main character, it's probably Terra. I mean, she's probably, in my experience, at least of the games beyond 6, the least developed and the most sort of one note main character that I've come across. And, to not make this, run on too long, in general, I found that the plot had interesting bits, but overall, I wasn't, after a certain point, especially come the World of Ruin, I wasn't really playing the game to see what happened next. And this is a game that I really I hadn't completely spoiled for myself. I knew a couple things in general about what happened in the game, but I didn't know play by play what was going to happen. And after a certain point, it was kind of just, I'm going to get my levels up, I'm going to get as many items as I can, and I'm going to see a bunch of the side stuff in the game. But the plot really sort of, once you got to the World of Ruin, became find the characters, scrambled across the world, confront Kefka, and the game's over. And it was disappointing because so many people hold this game in such high regard and really said it's one of the most memorable, incredible, life-changing gaming experiences you'll have. And I know it sounds like I'm taking a crap on this game right now. Trust me, I'm not saying this is a bad game at all, but I don't think this is a story that's going to stick with me and really affect me down the line. It was a good game. It was a good story. I enjoyed seeing what happened, but it's not one of my favorites and probably won't be something that years from now I really recall individual moments of. And that gets me to the last really major point of talking about the story and character part was Kefka. I've heard people mention that Kefka is not only one of the best Final Fantasy villains, but one of the best villains in gaming, and I was really, really, really excited to see, what all the fuss was about with him. And again, I was a bit let down, just in the sense that, just like the protagonist of the game, so little is given to you about why he's doing what he's doing. He is the very definition of a bad guy that wants to destroy everything for the sake of destroying everything, and then you defeat him and nothing else is really explained. I did find some of the things he said pretty funny. I think at the end of the game, when you confront him, at least in the PS1 version, I don't know about the different translations, but when you confront him at the end of the game, he says, and all the characters are giving a reason why they want to defeat Kefka and restore peace or whatnot. Kefka says something about, you all sound like a freaking self-help book. Like, there was moments that I did chuckle at what he said. He was a memorable villain, but just not that complex, and you see so little of him. I mean, the second half of the game, he's erected this tower and caused this destruction, but he's like barely present in the game. I feel like for a good 40 to 50% of the game, it was just, you were aware he was doing these things, but he wasn't involved enough to really, to me, come across as like menacing, or it's hard to really hate a character that you don't really care that much about or see that often. When you see him at the end of the game, it honestly felt like, I played this game little by little over the course of a couple months. It honestly had felt like months in real time since I had last encountered Kefka in the game. So, I mean, maybe it was just the way I was playing it, but he felt like such a non-factor until the end again. So all in all, the story aspect of it let me down a bit. There were elements that were cool. My favorite characters were probably Edgar and Sabin, because there was something, they were sort of entertaining, and the fact that they were brothers and had the whole family angle sort of made that kind of cool. I don't know. Something about Edgar especially struck me as just being a fun, interesting, cool character. But in general, I felt like most of them weren't established enough. I mean, Locke was sort of another major character who I felt like had a very by the numbers storyline. So the story isn't what I thought it was going to be cracked up to be, but it wasn't. It wasn't horrible. The next aspect that I want to talk about is the visuals, which anytime you're reviewing a game that's been around for 2 decades, obviously you're going into it grading on a different scale. So I wasn't expecting, you know, to be blown back into the couch looking at the TV while playing this game, but the graphics were fine. I began my gaming history, really got into it big time in the PS1 era. So I never really got to play a ton of stuff from the 16-bit era. So I don't really particularly have a fondness for that style. I know some people really love it, and a lot of people consider this to be the pinnacle of the way games can look and just absolutely love it. But for me, there's no nostalgia attached to playing games from that era, so I grade it. I mean, I go in knowing it's going to look that way, and it's neither here nor there for me. The game looked fine. I wish there was more variety in the locations. I felt like a lot of the towns, for the most part, looked similar enough that I honestly, after having spent 60 or so hours playing the game, probably couldn't differentiate one from the other. But there were cool areas. There were cool looking parts of the game. The characters' appearances were varied enough, especially for this era of gaming, that I appreciate the fact that they made 14 visually distinct characters that all were memorable, at least in their looks. The cutscenes, for the time, I'm sure were very impressive. They were still cool now. The opening scene with Terra, Biggs, and Wedge, the flying into Vector on the airship, and then the entire ending of the game I actually thought looked so awesome and cinematic for a game that old. As far as the way the game looked, I really have no complaints. I've played Chrono Trigger, and I know Chrono Trigger is considered to be probably a bit more technically advanced than Final Fantasy VI, and I do agree that it's probably a more impressive game presentation-wise, but Final Fantasy VI is fine. If you're playing an RPG from that era, I don't know what else you'd really want from a game. I mean, Chrono Trigger was sort of a crowning achievement of that style. So Final Fantasy VI, nothing about the way it looked really held me back from enjoying it in that regard. Just wish there was a bit more variety, but the game is so big, especially for that time, that I understand why they couldn't do distinctly individual models and sprites for every single square inch of the game. Trying to remember anything else that stood out visually. A lot of the attacks I thought looked pretty cool. A lot of the blitzes and a lot of Cyan's attacks. A lot of the spells. There was something really charming. I hadn't played many games from this era, so I really wasn't sure what to expect when it came to spell effects and attack effects. But even like using the Magitech armor in the beginning of the game, when you're first casting the spells, when you're going through Narsh, or however you pronounce it, at the beginning, just using all the different rays. Like, the game was more detailed visually than I thought it might be. When I first saw the graphics, I thought I really didn't know what to expect in terms of color and that kind of thing. But all in all, the visuals were fine. I think for that era, they were probably really impressive. They didn't keep me from enjoying the game at all. And overall, they weren't a detractor in any way. They were more a positive, I'd say. The third thing I wanted to talk about was the sound and music in the game. And this is another area where being a longtime Final Fantasy fan, I know that Final Fantasy has some of my favorite soundtracks in the history of gaming. I mean, I think Uematsu is probably my favorite game composer, and there's so many Final Fantasy songs that I could hum right now because they're just so ingrained into my brain and my being from both the amount of times I've heard them and how much I enjoyed them. But this was sort of a case where, long story short, the music in the game is really, really good. I really enjoyed it. My favorite songs in the game are Terra's theme, like the version that plays at the beginning of the game, and then even more so, the song, I think it's called Awakening. It's like Terra's theme that has like a piano, like a back and forth piano part that like plays during moments where she's like thinking about stuff. That's absolutely awesome. Like, that's one of the first songs that I think that first plays when she wakes up in Narsh at the house of the guy that's the head of the rebels, the returners. And as soon as I heard that, it immediately just had to go online and figure out what other people thought of it and look it up because it was awesome. But it was also kind of disappointing that my favorite song in the entire game came in the first hour because the music as a whole is great. I never got overly bored or disliked the music, but I did feel like having played later Final Fantasy games first, a lot of the songs reminded me of songs that are in other games in the Final Fantasy series. So I think I was just sort of used to that. And, had I played this first back in the day, I'm sure I would have been more captivated by the music because a lot of the songs, it just reminded me of songs I had heard later. So it wasn't anything that really blew me away. It was more, okay, this sounds like a Final Fantasy game, which is always good, but it isn't as cool as hearing something that just completely blows your mind or is so different. The main thing I wanted to talk about in this regard was the opera scene that, again, before I played the game, so many comments I had read and reviews I had watched, people always bring up the opera scene, the opera scene, the opera scene. I thought the opera scene was really cool, and I understand why people revere it and look back at it so fondly. Because I feel like it was probably a big undertaking and a very new, fresh thing to throw in such a different, very theatrical, it really broke the mold of grind, get a dungeons, get something, grind, get it. It introduced a level of narrative and a narrative break and shift in such a manner that I can see why it was so unique and so interesting and cool back in the day. And I still didn't think it was cool now, but I don't, not too much about it stood out to me enough that I personally wouldn't consider it one of my most memorable moments in gaming or anything. And like I've said since the beginning, a lot of things when it comes to gaming are tied to nostalgia. So again, so much about this game, I can easily see why when it came out back in the day, it was so groundbreaking for its time that people would be, even more in love now, on top of it being a good game for nostalgic reasons. So I'm not saying, I can easily understand why a lot of these things, opera scene included, would really speak to people. But for me, it was sort of a cool break in the action. The fact that they had the voices not saying anything but singing the melody of the songs was cool. I mean, the fact that they could even get that into a game back then and wrote actual melodies for this opera within the game shows how the level of commitment they had to really spicing up the game and stuff. But it was yet another moment that I could see why it was cool, but playing through the game didn't blow my mind. It didn't get me out of my chair. It was just another aspect of the game. On a final notes portion, my last section is going to be my overall review and final thoughts, in which I assign a score. And like I said, it's just subjective. It's just something for me to be able to refer back to and kind of keep track of what I think of games in some kind of numerical system, but don't read too much into it. The overall things I'd say about this game are, it's so easy to see how much this game influenced the series that came after it. And I don't want to talk too much about the later games because I plan to make videos about them because it's my favorite series of all time, and one of my my favorite game of all time is in the series, and I'll tell you which game that is when I make a video about it eventually. You could probably guess, given the era that I really began getting into gaming. But my overall thoughts, it's very, very easy to see how this game was groundbreaking, was a template for so many aspects of the games in the series that came after it. I think I'm a bit jaded in reviewing it because I have the perspective of, a crap ton more Final Fantasies since this that have taken aspects that Final Fantasy VI introduced to the world and, in my opinion, refined and improved most of them. But the simple fact that so many of them were introduced in 6 really makes me respect the hell out of it. I mean, the sheer number of playable characters from a gameplay standpoint, the desperation attacks, which I didn't love, but was a clear lead into eventual limit breaks. The Esper system that was very similar to a lot of the skill learning systems that came after it. The cinematic nature of the game, the open-endedness of the game, the insane amount of side quests, and the size of the game as a whole. I respect the hell out of these things, and I think that if I would have played this back in the day, I've been a couple years older, so that the SNES was really my first system and not the PS1, I'd probably be head over heels in love with this game. But because I'm coming to it from the perspective of having played games that took a lot of those things and I think improved them a bit, it just doesn't have the wow factor that it probably did for people that played it earlier and had an experience with this first. So I wouldn't call this the best Final Fantasy. I wouldn't call this one of my top 3 Final Fantasies probably, but that's graded on a scale that is going up against games that have a lot of advantages over this one. So I see this as an incredible pioneer in the series. Still an awesome RPG. I don't regret playing it at all. I loved playing it. I don't want to give the impression that I didn't enjoy this game, because I really did. I would recommend it to anyone who likes Final Fantasy. I'd recommend it to anyone who likes retro games. I'd recommend it to anyone who likes RPGs. I think it's absolutely worth playing. I went even a bit overboard like I do with most RPGs and got the entire team, or all 14 characters level 99 and all that stuff. So that swayed my opinion of the game as well, because I like grinding and stuff like that, but some people I know are just rushing through it, so that's going to change your perception. But overall, it's a game I would absolutely recommend playing. You definitely should. But if you've played later Final Fantasy games like I have, and you go back to this, you might long for certain things that have been bettered in the duration that don't exist in this game yet. So I'm going to give it a 9.0 out of 10. It's an A grade. I think it's an A game. I think it's a classic. And I absolutely did enjoy it, and you should play it. But I personally, Cameron, would not say that this is, from my subjective point of view, one of the best games ever made or the best Final Fantasy, because I think it's been improved upon in a lot of regards. So I hope you enjoyed this review. I'd love to hear what more people think about 6 and the series in general. I plan to make these. I've got probably 10 or 15 games that I've beat in the last 2 years that I want to slowly but surely get videos made on. I beat Final Fantasy 6 about 2 weeks ago. But there's a bunch of games I've beaten in the past year, 2 years, something like that I've been, are still enough in my memory that I could do these reviews on. And then once I get through all of them, I'll start doing games that I'm currently playing, as well as some other videos on just stuff I'm doing, movies, TV, music, beer, and just general topics. Like my last video about using guides when gaming. Sometimes I'll just want to talk about things that aren't a game review. They're just general topics remotely related to the field that I think could be interesting to talk about. So thank you guys so much for watching this. I have no idea how long this video was. This is probably the longest thing I've ever recorded in my life. But it is fun talking with you guys. Check out the channels I've recommended. Check this baby out for any of the bunch of systems it's available on. 9.0 out of 10. And take care, you guys. Thank you so much.